Hey, y'all, look at this.
Throughout elementary, high school, and college, none of this history was covered in my social studies classes.
Asian Americans remembering the void of information growing up, but no more. Illinois students will soon learn about Asian American struggle to advance civil rights and their tremendous contributions made in government, the arts, and sciences, with the impact of Asian American communities towards the economic, cultural, and political development of the United States.
What?
Illinois just became the first state in the nation to require public schools to teach Asian American history.
WGN's Julian Cruz live in Skokie, where Governor Pritzker just signed the bill. Hi, Julian.
Hey, Julia, Illinois making history in this year of hardship. Asian Americans enduring an ugly rash of hate crimes across our area and across the country, but now students across the state of Illinois will learn about the important historical contributions made by the Asian American and Pacific Islander community.
Yeah, so this was a little complicated, so I'm going to have to walk you through it. So basically, the Asian American and Pacific Islander group, quote unquote, has been awarded the luxury of having their history taught in public schools in America. Now, why is this important? Well, look at this.
All of those that are in favor of the motion and second to approve the mandatory African American history course. All approve. Okay. Any opposed? Okay.
Yeah, so if you can't already tell it's a problem, let's go a little deeper. So, on one hand, you're removing so-called African American or Black American history altogether from the schools. Meanwhile, you're implementing so-called Asian American and Pacific Islander history. Okay, well, let's look at this.
New Jersey has now become the second state in the nation to pass a law requiring schools to teach LGBT history in the classroom.
Public schools must include lessons about the political, economic, and social contributions of the LGBT community. The new law goes into effect at the start of the 2020 school year. Governor Murphy called the law a step toward inclusion and fairness.
And the rabbit hole gets deeper. So we are requiring, that means we must learn about Asian American and Pacific Islander and LGBTQIA2S plus community history. Meanwhile, they are actively taking out Black American history. But wait, there's more.
We're making Illinois the first state in the nation. Let me repeat that. We are making Illinois the first state in the nation to require that Asian American history will be taught in public schools. Students will learn about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned Chinese immigrants from coming to this nation at all. That was around the same time that my own great-grandfather, a Ukrainian Jewish refugee, was allowed in.
You see how the governor that made sure that this Asian American history is taught in school says he comes from a so-called Jewish background? A so-called Ukrainian Jewish background?
That was around the same time that my own great-grandfather, a Ukrainian Jewish refugee, that was around the same time that my own great-grandfather, a Ukrainian Jewish refugee.
What is that? What the f*** is that?
Just take a note of that. Also, look at this.
State Rep Jennifer Gong Gershowitz and fellow legislator State Senator Ram Villavelam, the architects of the new measure.
This historic measure makes Illinois the first state in the nation to set a standard for culturally competent Asian American history curriculum.
The two senators that were actually responsible for drafting the bill, both of them Asian American. And one of them is from India, still an Asian American. As I've told you before, the people from India are Asian. And one last thing, just for the cherry on top.
Number of Asian American leaders and number of Asian American leaders and number of Asian American leaders and students talking about their personal experience and having that feeling of being invisible and nobody knowing about the history, the tremendous history here in our area with a very strong Asian American and Pacific Islander community.
You see how every time when you tell a black person that we need leaders in our community and we need a certain code and we need certain black people who speak for black interests, you see how every black person and every other person tells you, oh, that's a ridiculous notion. There's no such thing as a black leader. Asians don't have leaders. They don't have leaders. Well, that's not what this man said. So let's recap. We have Black American history being taken out of the schools. We have Asian American and Pacific Islander as well as LGBTQIA2S plus history being taught in schools. We have Asian American leaders who include the Indians who have rallied together in order to draft bills that will ensure that their history is taught in schools. And all the while, black people ain't got shit. So I just wanted to remind you guys, hey, we need to stop complaining and come together on one accord. But that's just my opinion. Who do I know? I'm just a Please vibrate higher.